Welcome to another episode on my channel. Today I will tell you about the events that happened in 2017 that took place in Wilmslow, near Manchester in the UK. The McKie family recently moved to Wilmslow. 43-year-old Darren, 39-year-old Leanne and their 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter. The children range in age from 2 to 11. They moved to this city from Manchester and settled in the house, which was to be the fulfillment of their dreams. Wilmslow was a much smaller town than Manchester. However, it was known for being the chosen home of many millionaires, footballers or celebrities. For this reason, it is not the cheapest city to live in. However, prestige was the most important thing for the couple. Darren and Leanne were known to rather not live modestly and liked to surround themselves with luxury items. The vacations they went on were spent in the best hotels, expensive cars were parked in front of their house, and they didn't save on clothes or even their daily shopping, which they always did in one of Britain's more expensive supermarkets. Their children were able to participate in whatever activities they wanted after school. They participated in tennis, cricket, or ballet classes. Most people who knew them envied them such a life. It's just that on the outside they gave the impression of being rich people, while the truth was quite different. Both Darren and Leanne worked as police officers. He worked full-time, while his wife worked only 2 days a week. Together they earned £3,900 a month, so how could they afford all this? The family was definitely living beyond their means. After paying the home loan and other obligations, they had £80 left to live on, but with the help of credit cards and more loans, on average each month they spent £1,500 more than they earned. Darren had spent practically all his life more than he had, and taking out loans was nothing new to him. The couple was also often supported by their parents, both Darren and Leanne, but eventually they, too, could no longer lend to them. And since the couple's liabilities amounted to nearly £90,000, they made the decision to sell their home in Manchester and move to Wilmslow. They managed to find a 4-bedroom house that cost £435,000. After selling their Manchester property, they managed to pay off their debts and put down a large deposit to buy a new house. However, they were still forced to take out a mortgage. When they bought the house, they realized that it would need a little renovation, mainly because they wanted everything in it to be of the best quality possible. With the replacement of some things, which they took up immediately after buying this property, they could still hold off, but Darren and Leanne had no intention of waiting. They started a renovation during which they replaced everything that didn't suit them, and they were living in a rented house at the time. They spent a lot of money on this, and Darren took out new loans to be able to pay for it all. The man pretended to his wife all the time that everything was fine. Leanne had no idea about their debts and therefore did not hold back on new spending, which is surprising, especially since she herself worked in the police, so she should have known what her husband's salary was. When they bought the house, they immediately replaced the windows in the entire building, despite the fact that the old ones could serve for some more time. They paid almost £6,000 for this. Another big and certainly in their situation unnecessary expense was a granite countertop for the kitchen, on which they spent nearly £4,000. The couple was used to buying more expensive items, and they had no intention of changing that. Darren assured his wife that he had everything under control, when the truth was in addition to the mortgage. They also had many smaller loans. They have even found themselves in such a situation where banks refused to give them new loans. Also, smaller companies that were in the business of lending to people who could not borrow money from banks refused to lend money to the couple. In late August 2017, Darren applied for another loan from some lesser-known company. Unfortunately, since at the time he was paying off both his mortgage and smaller loans, as well as having to pay rent on the house they were living in for the time of renovation, his application was rejected. The rejection letter was delivered to their home and ended up in Leanne's hands. She was surprised to learn that her husband was trying to get a new loan, without informing her. She immediately contacted her husband, trying to get some answers from him, but he refused to admit that he was actually the one who had applied for the loan. He began to pretend that he didn't know what was going on, and suspected that perhaps someone using his data was trying to steal from him in this way. He did everything just to avoid admitting to Leanne what their financial situation really was. She had no idea that their debt had grown to £115,000. She eventually believed her husband that someone was trying to extort money by using his data. Darren had no intention of stopping there. He decided to try taking out a loan again. He applied for a loan from another company. He was going to borrow £54,000 from them, and since the house against which this loan was to be taken was in the names of Darren and Leanne, the loan also had to be in both of their names. Therefore, in addition to his passport and pay slip, Darren also had to send in his wife's documents. Fortunately, he knew the login information needed for his wife's account, where he was able to access her income statements. He already had everything he needed to submit the application. All he still had to do was forge Leanne's signature, and he was done. The only thing left for him was to wait for an answer on the matter. And in the meantime, the renovation work on the new house came to an end. And the whole family could finally leave the house they had been renting for 6 months and move into the house of their dreams. They settled in there on September 16th. There was still a lot of work to be done there, especially on the outside, but inside, the house was in such a state that they could already move in. When Darren sent the documents to the company, where he was going to take out a loan, he didn't anticipate just one thing. That company, once it had made photocopies of all the documents, sent them back to the address of the house, where they ended up in the hands of Leanne. And when Leanne opened the envelope on September 28th, and saw the 2 passports and the information about the loan Darren had applied for, she couldn't believe what she was seeing. She immediately tried to contact him and explain everything. But Darren was at work and didn't answer his phone. His wife texted him a few times, letting him know that she already knew about the loan. She also wanted to find out what was going on, whether they were having financial problems again. She had never heard of the company before. She couldn't understand why her husband hadn't told her about anything. After all, this was not a small loan, but more than £50,000. Darren did not answer her questions. But at 11:32 a.m. he wrote her a message, whether he would be home soon. That day he had plans to finish work early, because he had an appointment at 1:30 p.m. with the home valuation man. Leanne was working the afternoon shift that day. And at 1:30 p.m. she was probably not going to be there. After receiving a message from his wife, Darren decided to finish work sooner than he had previously anticipated and return home to talk to her. What happened after he returned home? Only he knows, but one can guess that there was a quarrel between the couple. A fight that brought the man to such a state that something inside him snapped. He could no longer bear the stress associated with constant debts, more loans, and pretending that everything was as fine as possible. He had had enough of it all, and at that point he began to vent his anger on his wife, which unfortunately ended in her death. When Darren realized what he had just done, he knew that he had to act quickly, because there wasn't much time left until his scheduled meeting with the man from the loan company. There was no way he could hide Leanne's body somewhere, because the man, in the course of the evaluation, had the right to look into any, even the smallest storage compartment. He could have accidentally stumbled upon Leanne's body. Therefore, Darren decided that he would put it in the trunk of his wife's car and park it just a few streets away. Far enough away that the children would not notice the vehicle on their return from school, yet close enough so that he can walk home from there. He will decide what to do next later. Surveillance cameras installed on nearby houses registered that at 12:45 the man parked a red Mini belonging to Leanne, with his back to the door of the house, and put her body in the trunk. He drove the car to a nearby housing development and left it there. When he returned home, the man he had an appointment with was already waiting for him in his car. He arrived earlier than scheduled. After a few minutes, the man knocked on the door of Darren's house and conducted a valuation, which took him about 40 minutes. During this time, Darren acted as if nothing had happened. Definitely looking at him, it was impossible to tell that a tragedy had occurred moments earlier. As soon as the man left the house, Darren began sending messages to his wife. He had been working in the police department for more than 20 years. He knew that his phone would be checked and thus tried to provide himself with an alibi. He still had some time to pick up his children from school. Therefore, he went to the neighborhood where his wife's car was parked, and started driving it around the neighborhood, wondering where he would be able to dispose of the body. He knew he would do it later, when evening come. But while it was still light, he could find a suitable place. He wanted to dump the body not too close to home, and as he drove he was reminded that sometimes with his whole family, went to a certain restaurant for dinner. And he associated that he saw a sign there warning that there was some deep body of water nearby. He already knew that this was where he would come at night. Except that he made one mistake, which is surprising because he was a police officer and was aware of what is being paid attention to during a murder investigation. When he drove there, he took his phone with him, and Leanne's phone was also in the car. Later, investigators had no the slightest difficulty in determining the fact that both phones were logging in the same locations at the time. Since Darren already had the location of his choice, where he would leave his wife's body, he could already return home, especially since it was approaching 3 p.m., which meant he had to go to school to pick up the kids. He parked his car in the same neighborhood as before and walked home, from where he picked up his Audi and drove to the school. There he again acted as if nothing had happened. He talked with other parents, joked from time to time. None of them could even suspect that he had just killed his wife. After picking up the children, he drove them to the clubs, which they attended, and when they returned home, he made them dinner. The children knew that their mother was scheduled to work that day, therefore no one was surprised by her absence. Darren waited until evening, when the children were already asleep, and at 10:30 p.m. he started his plan. He left his sons and daughter alone at home and walked toward the estate, where Leanne's car was located. This time he did not take his phone with him, he left it at home, which was supposed to be a confirmation of the fact that he was not going anywhere at the time. His wife's body had been in the trunk for nearly 10 hours. The man drove to a predetermined location, however, when he arrived there, where he was going to dump Leanne's body, it turned out that the water level was so low that there was no way to leave her there. He had to quickly come up with something new, find a new place to leave the body. But before he started driving around the area, he threw away Leanne's phone. This was to confuse the investigators, who would be investigating his wife's death. Darren felt that he was in control of everything, that what he was doing would allow him to avoid responsibility for killing his wife. After all, he was a police officer, he knew well how investigations are conducted. Once he got rid of the phone, he started driving around the area, looking for a new place, and finally came across a lake, located about 10 kilometers from his home. He was anxious to leave Leanne's body in the water. He was well aware of the fact that the water would effectively destroy all traces he could leave on his wife's body. He parked the car as close to the lake, as close as possible, after which he took Leanne's body out of the trunk and dragged it into the water. He left her by the very shore, close enough for someone to notice her. He laid her face down, hoping that when she was found, she would be recognized as a drowning victim. The only thing else he had to do was to get rid of his wife's car. He knew that he could not drive it home and park it in front of the house, therefore he left it about 1.5 kilometers from the place where he left Leanne's body, and from there he decided to return home on foot. He faced a rather long walk, almost 9 kilometers, but as a police officer he thought that this solution would be the best. Only that at around 1:30 a.m. the man was stopped by a police patrol, who was looking for the burglars. The officer spoke with him for a while, and in the course of that conversation, Darren said them that he was just returning home, which is located nearby. However, he refused to give his personal information. He felt that he had not broken the law, therefore he has no obligation to do so. And after a short conversation, the policeman left, and Darren continued on his way. But Darren was unlucky, because 45 minutes later the same patrol drove past him again. The policeman immediately took notice of him, and began to be suspicious toward his person. First of all, almost an hour earlier he said that he was already close to home. Apparently, however, this was not true, since after that time he still failed to get there. The second issue that the officers brought to their attention was that the man had no shoes. He was walking in socks. They were sure that when they spoke with him earlier there were shoes on his feet. And here they were right. Darren, of course, had shoes on earlier, but during the walk home he noticed that they were stained with blood. He knew he had to get rid of them, because they would provide evidence against him. And since he was already not far from his home, and he knew that on the street he was walking down the waste containers would be emptied that morning, he decided that throwing them away would be the ideal solution. He threw his shoes into one of the bins, which he passed, and could be sure that in just a few hours there would be no trace of them. What he didn't expect, however, was that he might run into the same police patrol, who would take an interest in the fact that he was not wearing shoes. This time the officers started asking him more questions. Darren knew he would have to say something more than that he was just returning home. He informed the officers that he was trying to find his wife. He does not know where she might be, and unfortunately she is not answering his phone calls. When asked why he doesn't try to find her by driving, after all, that way would be more effective, Darren admitted that he had drunk some wine earlier and didn't feel comfortable driving. As for the shoes, which were not on his feet at the time, they were so tight and uncomfortable that he decided to get rid of them. Police officers didn't quite believe these explanations. They sensed that Darren was lying to them, however, they noticed at the time that he was wearing police trousers. And when asked about it, he had no choice, he had to recognize that he too was a police officer. Darren was driven home, where officers spoke with him for a while longer. Following their advice, he tried to contact his wife again, but of course, he was unsuccessful, therefore he left a message for her. The police officers watched him the entire time they were in his home, and noticed that for a person who cannot find his wife, he was behaving very calmly. Darren was extremely composed, and showed absolutely no emotion. They knew that he was also a police officer, and in matters of professional concern he had to be able to control his emotions. However, this was a situation involving his family. Surprisingly, even at the time, he did not show any nervousness. When, after receiving the report that Leanne was missing, officers left his house, Darren turned on the washing machine, in which he placed all the clothes he was wearing. He had to be sure that no evidence would be found on them. Once the clothes were in the washing machine, the man went to sleep. However, something happened again that Darren had not considered. Because his fellow officers, who had taken up the search for Leanne, showed up at his house again at 4 o'clock in the morning. They wanted the man to use a special app, linking his phone to Leanne's phone, try to determine the whereabouts of her cell phone. As the police officers stood over him the entire time and watching what he was doing, Darren had no choice. He just had to do what they asked him to do. He was convinced, however, that he would not be able to find his wife's phone, because he had thrown it into the water. However, in the place where he left it, there was so little water that the phone was still working. Its battery was close to running out, with only 5% remaining. But it still managed to locate where it was. Darren knew very well where he was, and the police officers took a picture of this map and sent it to other patrols to check. Since they had no further questions for him at that time, they left his house. Before they went outside, however, they noticed one detail. There was a washing machine on in the man's house, which immediately aroused their suspicions, because who does laundry in the middle of the night? They didn't talk to Darren about it, but it was puzzling to them. When Leanne's phone location has been made available to other patrols, one of them immediately went to this place. And her phone was quickly found, which was right next to the deep water sign. Since there was almost no water at that time, it was in such good condition that there was no problem to recover data from it. And it is from this phone, later, the most evidence against Darren was obtained. But right after finding the cell phone, the policemen were still wondering where Leanne might be. They tried to find her near the place where was the phone found, but she was nowhere to be found. At that time, the police did not know that a few kilometers away there was a man returning home at 3:45. He noticed the body of a woman lying in the water. When the police arrived on the scene, it was not immediately known that she was the missing Leanne McKie. No documents were found on her, but the description they received from Darren matched the woman found in the lake. Oddly enough, Leanne's husband was seen twice that night. in places between this lake and their home. I guess it couldn't have been a coincidence. That's why the man was immediately arrested, as the person who contributed to Leanne's death. The police arrived at his house shortly after 5 a.m., and Darren was taken in for questioning. However, he did not plead guilty. He was supposed to know nothing about his wife's death, and he certainly wasn't the one who killed her. He didn't plead guilty for a long time. Only after some time he changed his testimony. He then stated that when he returned home, she was there, and then an argument broke out between them. Later, for some reason, they both got into his wife's car. And they went. They found themselves in the place where her phone was later found. It was a place where they often stayed with their entire family. Darren had to go home because at 1:30 p.m., a man will come to do a home valuation. However, Leanne wanted nothing to do with the new loan and refused to go home. Then the couple separated. Darren came home and didn't know what his wife was doing at the time. He never saw her again either. He suspected that maybe she wanted to think it all over, and while she was walking alone near the lake, she was killed. His testimony did not match the evidence at all, collected during further investigation. Most information was obtained from Leanne's phone. Darren was texting her, asking how she was doing, why doesn't she call, and that he is worried about her. However, according to his testimony, at the same time, they were both supposed to be in the same car, driving around the neighborhood. It didn't make any sense. The police also managed to find shoes that Darren threw in the bin that night, located on the road leading to his house. There were traces of blood on it, whose tests confirmed that it belonged to Leanne. The DNA samples were taken from inside the shoes, confirmed that they were worn by Darren. Additionally, ground was found on their soles, which had exactly the same composition, like ground located near the lake where Leanne was found. You can also add recordings from surveillance cameras, showing Leanne's car, which the man parked backwards in front of the door of their house, as well as him driving away in that car to walk home after a while. Investigators managed to collect a lot of evidence against Darren, but despite this, when the trial began in March 2018. In this case, the man initially did not confess to the murder. But after 9 days of trial and hearing all the evidence that was collected, he realized that he had no choice but to admit his guilt. He admitted that he killed his wife, but it was the result of an unfortunate accident. However, he had no intention of going into details as to what exactly happened that day. Only Darren knows how Leanne died. The autopsy revealed 2 neck bones were broken, which clearly indicated that she had been strangled. Darren's defense attorney tried to convince the jury that she died as a result of an unfortunate accident. The jury came back with a verdict, finding Darren guilty of murdering his wife. The judge assumed he was on his way home from work. On September 28th, he had no intention of killing his wife, but the quarrel brought him to such a state that the only solution for him was to kill Leanne. He knew that if she reported that he had forged her signature and applied for a loan on her behalf, he could say goodbye to his career as a policeman. He had too much to lose. He couldn't let this happen. When Leanne was dead, he used the skills that he acquired during all these years spent in the police to hide the evidence of his actions. However, he made the mistake of taking his wife's phone, as he went to look for a place to leave her body. He also couldn't have predicted that he would be noticed twice by the same police patrol immediately after abandoning his wife's body. He was sentenced to life imprisonment for killing Leanne, and the minimum period he must spend in prison is 19 years. Darren is serving a sentence in Liverpool prison, which is considered the worst prison in Great Britain. The couple's 3 children are now raised by Leanne's parents. They do everything in their power to ensure that they lack nothing, especially love. However, they know that nothing can replace their mother. And this is the end of this story. Thank you for listening, and until next time, take care of yourself and goodbye for now.